Hi, today I would like to talk about something that I've written about in the past under the heading of the war on sense-making. So let's frame it like this. For a very long period of time, as far as I can tell, at least as long as since that giant obelisk helped chimpanzees figure out how to kill each other with bones, we've been working on different ways to become more effective at killing each other with weapons. And yet, at the same time, there was a particular moment when the combination between our incessant drive to figure out how to blow each other up met with a new set of innovations in science, most notably physics and chemistry, and in economy, most notably the industrial economy, to create a distinctly new capacity along this long history of figuring out how to kill each other. And this new capacity accelerated through the 19th and 20th centuries until it reached what seems to have been a peak, roughly in the 1950s, where with the invention of the hydrogen bomb, we had reached the singular moment where we had the capacity to, in fact, extinct ourselves as a species and possibly cleanse the entire globe of biological life. And the point being that that was both a function of a particular combination of capacities and the cessation, to a greater or lesser extent, of a particular arc in the history of war. Which is to say that, for sure, we have continued to complete the set in all the different tools in the toolkit of how to kill each other. But everything kind of pales in comparison to mass nuclear holocaust. Now, within that same notion, right, the idea of there being a very long arc and yet there being a shift in capabilities which has led to an acceleration, I would like to then consider a different story, a very closely allied story, which is to say that for a very long period of time, people have noticed that there is a way to achieve differential individual advantage by being good at lying to, manipulating, and deceiving other people. And of course, this fact has shown up in various kinds of technologies of this type forever. And yet, round about the turn of the 20th century, round about the point at which the arc of weapons of mass destruction was beginning to reach its apex, we entered into a new triangle. In this case, the sciences had turned from outward, physics and chemistry, to inward, psychology, cognitive neuroscience itself. The economy had in turn turned from industrialization and the deployment of energy to commercialization and the creation of the consumer culture. And war had turned into the war on sense-making. Now, and in just the same way as the previous war, once that triangle had been established, accelerated from musket to nuke, my proposition is that something similar to that has actually happened in the domain of the war on sense-making. And this is where things get interesting. While it is daunting to be present to the explosive, destructive capacities of a hydrogen bomb, it is at least obvious. By contrast, an accelerating capacity in a war on sense-making is by definition increasingly occult. Let me put this a slightly different way. In the 1970s, for a variety of reasons, we, meaning specifically the people of the United States, became aware of certain activities that had been undertaken, largely but not exclusively by the CIA, as their part in the Cold War portion of the war on sensemaking. One piece of this uncovering was part of something called the Church Commission. Now, in the Church Commission, we became aware of the fact that the CIA had been doing things that had not been known before, and oddly enough, are broadly not well understood now, and we're going to get into that in a second. But things like a project called MKUltra, another one called Mockingbird, Northwoods, Paperclip, all of which were real, meaning that they're not made up, sophisticated, commanded substantial resources, and clearly involved researching how to more fully extend and develop capacities in the war on sensemaking. None of this is to say that the CIA is, or was, particularly either malevolent or uniquely skillful in this proceeding. After all, there was a war on, and war is a competition, and in competition, you work hard to be more effective than those with whom you're competing. And there's an interesting characteristic that I don't think is fully grasped enough, which is that innovation is hard and copying is easy. And so when you're engaged in a competition along the threshold of innovation, this puts a premium on being skillful at innovation, pushing the state-of-the-art forward, but also has this interesting consequence that all of your competitors more or less get your innovation for free to the degree to which they can identify what it was, they can copy it, and then the state of the field moves, right? So this actually pushes the entire field forward along the threshold of innovation. So for example, it was really hard to invent the atomic bomb, but 2 years after we had done that, the Soviets had copied it, or whatever, a few years after we had done that. Now, part of that was through the use of espionage, but it doesn't matter. The point is that innovation is hard and copying is easy, however it is you go about doing your copying. The point being that, one, we can imagine that the CIA was part of a larger field of play of many different agents, of whom the KGB was certainly a key piece, but not the only, who are all exploring the overall space of the war on sensemaking. And every single time any of them made any meaningful form of innovation, each would endeavor to copy that and move the field of play forward. So this then has an interesting implication. When we look at the state of the art as we were able to see it, to the degree which, by the way, that was a valid seeing at all. We saw something. It's not clear we saw everything at the Church Commission. The state of the art in the mid-70s of the CIA, we should propose that that state of the art was broadly shared by many other players, and even to the degree to which we might imagine that the various laws that were passed restricting CIA activity in the 70s had any impact, obviously those didn't have any impact on the rest of the folks in the war on sensemaking, so the field of play would have continued to accelerate. And so we have a question. We haven't actually had call it a ping or a discovery of the current state of the art of the various tools and techniques in the war on sensemaking since then. So for 40 years or so, something's been going on, and we don't really have any insight into what that something is. And yet, if the model is even vaguely like the model that was proposed with regard to weapons of mass destruction, you might say that the 70s maybe represented World War I in that story, which is to say the very beginning of the introduction of airplanes and tanks, large cannons in trench warfare, and that we should expect to be somewhere around the introduction of the atomic bomb in the war on sensemaking, and it's not clear exactly what that is. Does that make sense? The point being, if you aren't right now wondering how effective various potential agents are at deception, manipulation, confusion, then either you have a uniquely high capacity to endure uncertainty, or you're not really thinking clearly about the implications of the war on sense-making. And then the final point. Well, weapons of mass destruction are quite problematic. And the ability to actually deploy destruction at a level that could extinguish the species is quite a bit of a problem. Their moral equivalent in the domain of sense-making is substantially worse. As mentioned, for example, at the very least, weapons of mass destruction are obvious. So we can see them and we can feel them and we can sense the dangers that they pose and therefore endeavor to respond to them. The weapons of the war on sense-making are destructive precisely to that capacity. We cannot see them. We cannot make sense of them. We cannot understand them, and therefore we cannot respond to them. Past a certain threshold, we may in fact be so fully removed from our ability to make sense that we will be simply incapable of responding to them. And so if you feel like the combination between commercial technology and that degree of human endeavor that has carefully figured out how to convince someone that making a choice between peppermint soap and spearmint soap is a meaningful choice, the entire set of sciences associated with how human beings go about using mind in the world, and the military-industrial complex. You're right. And getting a hold of that and a grasp of that is a big piece of any valid strategy in the contemporary environment.